Explanation and his version of this encounter.
Coached and written up for him, insincerity, lack of responsibility.
In the week since the viral video of an encounter between Omaha tribal elder Nathan Phillips and a group of white teenagers from an all-boys private Catholic high school in Kentucky, including the teen who became the face of the incident, Covington Catholic student Nick Sandman, both Phillips and Sandman have had a chance to tell their stories in the media. The story has followed some patterns that we've become all too familiar with. The right jumping in on the side of the students, and supporters of Phillips accusing some in the media of demonizing an indigenous senior citizen in order to exonerate the white teens. Some things, however, were not so typical. Sandman, for instance, had help formulating his response from a PR firm hired by his family. The firm, called Run Switch, is run in part by this man, Scott Jennings, a longtime Republican operative who worked in the George W. Bush White House and occasionally advises Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Back with me, E.J. Dion and Jonathan Capehart, and also joining me, national organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network, Dallas Goldtooth. And Mr. Goldtooth, I'm going to go to you first on this. What did you make of the pile-on of Nathan Phillips by some in right-wing media, including the New York Post and others, going after both his war service during Vietnam and even some teenage arrests, essentially attacking him when he was a teenager, for things he did when he was a teenager?
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me on this show. We need to see more Native peoples on mass media in this light, talking about amazing, powerful things that's happening within Indian country. The second thing is I really want to commend relative Nathan Phillips for the tremendous act of bravery and courage it took for him to step into that situation in hopes to try to diffuse a lot of hostilities that he was witnessing in that moment. I think it's inexcusable how mass media is trying to flip the switch here, but it's not surprising. We've seen this happen time after time where black and brown folks get attacked for something, and at the end of the day, after a number of weeks, they become, it becomes viewed as though they were the aggressors. He was not the aggressor in this situation. Nathan Phillips, I've worked with him for many years on many different fights against the Keystone XL pipeline, against the Dakota Access pipeline, and he's one of the most humblest people I've ever met in my life. He's a tremendous asset to the community, and so I have the utmost respect for what he did. The behavior that we saw is inexcusable. I mean, since the first videos came out, we've seen longer videos, we've seen the bigger picture, but the behavior that we saw that the kids enacted is utterly inexcusable and shows a deeply rooted sense of superiority and privilege that white people feel towards black and brown people, specifically in this case, indigenous peoples. And we really have to call it out for that, what it is, white supremacy. So I think that it's absurd, but it's not surprising to see right-wing media to try to flip the switch to make it seem as though Nathan Phillips was the aggressor in this situation, and to really absolve the youth and their behavior, in particular the chaperones and their lack of involvement to control their youth and the ugly displays of mockery and racism that they displayed on that day.
You know, and to that point, Jonathan, because you covered, you know, in the Black Lives Matter cases, a similar thing would happen where the victim who is dead and who can't speak for themselves anymore, over time, the evolution of the story, even sometimes in mainstream media, are the bad acts or the bad behavior or something negative to make the dead, you know, child, or the dead kid in those cases, or young man, seem like they were aggressive, that they were hostile, that they were at fault. You did see a certain evolution, even in some mainstream media of the coverage, that reversed the situation to make Nathan Phillips sound like he was the aggressor, like he went after the young man, the teenager, Sandman. There was a guy called Kyle Smith in the National Review who made this point. He said, should these kids' lives be ruined because some of them responded to obnoxious provocation by being a bit rude themselves? I'd say the reaction was, if anything, more restrained than you would expect from teenagers. And just if we can find the video of not Sandman, but of the kids who were whooping and jumping and sort of making pretend Native American, you know, exhortations themselves. I want to show that, because that to me is the bigger picture we're missing. But you had a response to him in which you said the assessment only applies to white kids, and that it didn't apply to kids like Jordan Davis. It didn't apply to kids like Dejaria Becton. It doesn't apply to black kids. Can you expound on that a little?
Yeah, so in the quote in his piece, just before the pull quote you showed, he says, up until 10 minutes ago, you know, we let teenagers be teenagers and do stupid stuff. And that jumped out at me, because Jordan Davis he was 17, he would still be alive if he hadn't been murdered because his music was too loud. Or Tamir Rice, who was 12, wouldn't have been shot and killed by police for playing with a toy gun in a Cleveland park. And DeJaria Becton was 15 years old in a bikini at a Texas pool party and was manhandled by police. So the idea that, oh, teenagers are teenagers and they do stupid stuff is just ridiculous. It only applies to white kids. And we have to remember here, the right is trying to say, aha, the media got it wrong, everyone's gotten it wrong, and some person on the right sent out what they called the long-form video, which came from the Black Hebrew Israelites, by the way. Mm-hmm. And so I sat and watched it twice. And when you watch the full video, you see exactly what went down and what happened. And to Mr. Goldtooth's point, what I came away with was, where were the chaperones? Anybody from an urban area knows who the Black Hebrew Israelites are. Yeah. They're crazy. They've yelled racist, homophobic things at me. They yell racist, homophobic, xenophobic things at everyone. If you are in town from out of town and you see 5 crazy people yelling horrible things at you, do you let your children get close to those people and engage them? Or, as chaperones and parents, do you remove them, move them out of the way? Why not take them up to the top of the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where the view of the National Mall is fantastic? But instead, they let them get there and engage. And what you see in the Black Hebrew Israelites' own video is Mr. Phillips coming in, separating the two sides. Even the Black Hebrew Israelites say, uh-oh, here comes Dad, here he comes, coming in between us.
Yeah.
Believe your own eyes when you see these situations and what's happening.
Yeah, and we're going to show that video just a little bit as I ask you, EJ, because the Catholic diocese that covers this, Bishop Roger Foy's, the Covington diocese, actually apologized to the teenager, to Sandman, saying we should not have allowed ourselves to be bullied and pressured into making a statement prematurely, and we take full responsibility for it. I especially apologize to Nicholas Sandman and his family, as well as to all CovCath families who felt abandoned during this ordeal. A couple of points. This is a private school that's quite expensive. I'm sure his parents had something to say about the school making a statement apologizing to the elder. And this is an affluent place where Sandman can afford to hire a PR firm. But the Catholic Church has a particular history with Native Americans that is fraught, and that is in this particular case. I don't know. What do you make of the fact that this has become an issue between a Catholic diocese which sent students to be political actors at the March for Life, to make a political statement with their presence, but who are now saying, but they're just kids, and apologizing to them?
Well, actually, I think when you look around the media, there were a lot of very different reactions from Catholics to all of this. There were a lot of Catholics, I think, who were particularly disturbed by the disrespect showed to the Native American elder. And that's a very important piece of this. And people who've watched the whole video, people like Jonathan or people like Josh Marshall at Talking Points Memo, who also wrote a great piece on this, said, look, it's fair to say that some of those kids may have been thrown, may have looked confused, and that, yeah, we all have to be careful about little snippets of video that go out and drawing big conclusions. But there really can't be much doubt about the hooping and hollering at Mr. Phillips, and that there is something wrong with that. And I think we also have to think about the symbolism of the MAGA hat now. And I think the Right to Life movement has to think hard about whether it's allowing itself to be taken over by the Trump movement. I mean, and there are pro-immigrant Right to Life people, anti-abortion people, but taking kids away from their parents at the border is not pro-life and it's not pro-family. So I think there should be another debate on the other side, and this shouldn't be confined to attacks on the left.
Yeah, and I'm going to give Mr. Goldtooth the last word on this because, you know, you've seen the attacks on the elder for things he did as a teenager, but, you know, when it came to Brett Kavanaugh, we were supposed to excuse him for things he did as a teenager. What does this say to you just about the general respect for Indigenous people in this country? I'm thinking as we head into the Super Bowl that we have people of your community used as mascots, people whose names are appropriated for the names of teams, just the general disbelief, people not believing Elder Phillips, even with video. I don't know. I'm going to let you have the last word on that.
I appreciate that. I think that one thing that's just to be aware of is that the response from the Native community and our allies on this issue didn't come out of a vacuum. It's born out of hundreds and hundreds of years of unresolved oppression and the erasure of Indigenous peoples from the history of this land. And we really have to be mindful of how white supremacy operates and by erasing Indigenous narratives and regulating us to be only to be mascots and colorful imagery for their games. I think you're pretty spot on with that, and I think it's really spot on to call out the hypocrisy that we're seeing from the right on this issue. Whether you have Trump making a tweet about this issue, but he's not saying anything about Steve King and the racist comments that he exhibited and said. Like, come on now, let's really see it for what it is. It's just trying to spin a story that benefits them. And I think that really we have to talk about the greater issues here. What the horrible part about this all is that this instance kind of overshadowed what was happening that day was the Indigenous Peoples March. And it was a march to really advocate for Indigenous people's rights and to really elevate the issue of murder and missing Indigenous women, which is a critical issue that's happening across Indian country and across this country and also in Canada that's completely unknown to the greater mainstream media. We have to talk about these things and talk about the greater struggles that Indigenous peoples are going through at this moment.
Indeed, and you made a very good point that there needs to be more people like yourself on television shows like this one. We're going to strive to do that on this show. And yeah, the Indigenous Peoples March, it's sad that this is the only narrative that came out of it because there was a lot more to it. Thank you, sir. E.J. Dion, Jonathan Capehart, Dallas Goldtooth, thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. And up next.